Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. We will begin in a few minutes because I think we have some additional folks registering. Hey there, everyone. For those of us just joining, we're going to give folks a few minutes to register and then we'll get started. Okay, it looks like we're getting most folks into the room. I think we'll give it another minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Great. Okay, it looks like we have a critical mass. Well, hey everyone, I am Zal Shroff. I'm the acting legal director at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm also the lead attorney representing the cohort of current and former San Francisco officials and civic organizations that filed a brief with the US Supreme Court today in the case Grants Pass versus Johnson, which is a case that will determine whether falling asleep while homeless can be considered a crime in the United States. So I'm going to give some opening remarks about the substance of the brief that we filed at the Supreme Court today, and then you'll hear directly from several of the amici who we represented on this brief. We have with us today Angela Chan from San Francisco Public Defender Mano Raju's office. We have Kaki Marshall, San Francisco's former director of temporary shelter. Brandon Green, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Western Center on Law and Poverty, and Chesa Boudin, former District Attorney of San Francisco. I'll plan to speak for about 10 minutes by way of background, and then each of our amici here today will speak for about 5 minutes from their own perspectives. And then we'll hold 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. And if we don't get to your questions, we're more than happy to speak after the press conference. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll begin with an overview of the brief we filed at the Supreme Court and explain some of its key points. But before we do that, we have to start by understanding the case that's actually before the Supreme Court. The city of Grants Pass in Oregon has made it a criminal offense to sleep outside with so much as a blanket anywhere within the city limits. Now, that effectively means that dozens of unhoused residents who fell on hard times were being jailed just for being poor. This form of status-based punishment for circumstances beyond one's control was declared a cruel and unusual punishment by the Supreme Court decades ago in the 1960s. The United States government, the state of California, the city of San Francisco, the city of Los Angeles, Governor Newsom, and Mayor London Breed have all submitted briefs in this case that say that what Grants Pass has done, which is to criminalize homelessness, is a clear violation of the US Constitution. And not only that, but it's illogical. Jailing someone for being poor does not magically mean that they can afford to pay rent. So these kinds of punishments are not only cruel and unusual, they don't work. If anything, they actually make homelessness far worse. Policing people from block to block does not get them off the street and into housing. It only entrenches poverty, makes it harder for them to keep their jobs, and sticks them with further fines they cannot hope to ever pay if they cannot afford rent. So this criminal apparatus is hugely expensive, and it also costs the community more in the long run by doing absolutely nothing to address homelessness. So criminalizing homelessness is then both unconstitutional and illogical. And what's remarkable is that there is universal agreement on this point from both the United States government and all California leaders. They have told the Supreme Court that Grants Pass, Oregon has behaved unconstitutionally. And that's the end of this case. So that begs the question, why are we here? And specifically, why did California politicians push for the Supreme Court to take this case in the first place? And the reality is that our leaders have chosen to play politics instead of doing their jobs. They have stoked a tremendous amount of misinformation to blame federal judges for their own refusal to properly address homelessness or meet state affordable housing targets. And nowhere is that truer than in San Francisco. So the Amicus brief unpacks that misinformation piece by piece, and we'll give you the highlights of that here. Starting with the first myth that we saw in the briefing from California politicians. And that's that California's unhoused people are vagrants. We constantly hear the talking point that it's because California cities are too liberal, that there are droves of unhoused people who come here to take advantage of lenient policies and good weather. That is false. More than 90% of unhoused people are from California, with 75% living in the very same California county where they first were priced out of their homes. In San Francisco, it's the vast majority of unhoused people who were living and working here before becoming homeless, and the majority of that group called San Francisco home for a decade or more before they lost their ability to pay rent. So what's actually happening here? Because it's not the weather. The reality is that decades of explicitly racist local housing laws caused an affordable housing crisis here in California starting in the 1970s. That forced unprecedented numbers of Black and brown families out onto the street and into homelessness, which was by design, and that's well documented. But instead of taking steps to correct that affordable housing crisis over the past 50 years, places like San Francisco have failed every state mandate for affordable housing production by thousands and thousands of units, which forces even more hardworking San Franciscans onto the streets every year. This is not drugs. This is not mental health. This is not poverty tourism. We are in this mess because our government continues to fail on the affordable housing crisis it created. And California knows this. The Newsom administration has actually reported as much, and this is also well documented in our brief. That brings us to the second myth, which is that California cities cannot enforce health, safety, and accessibility laws or address encampments. Now, California jurisdictions have told the Supreme Court that they are powerless to ensure safe and clean streets, to remove fire hazards, to ensure streets are accessible to those with disabilities, to address street encampments, and a whole laundry list of horribles, all because of federal judges enforcing the Constitution. That is also false. The only thing the Eighth Amendment prevents is citing, fining, and arresting someone just for sleeping outside. There are a litany of California health and safety laws that address each and every one of the situations that these cities have mentioned, including fire hazards and blocking rights of way. These laws are all carefully listed in our brief as well. But importantly, unhoused people also want safe and clean streets, and they're in fact the people most likely to have physical disabilities and need access to the sidewalk. So again, the only thing that is unconstitutional is punishing someone for sleeping outside, which California politicians already acknowledge is both wrong and does not work. That brings us to our third myth, which is that somehow there's now a right to camp outside. So California cities have suggested that the courts have tied their hands because homeless people now have a right to camp outside anywhere, at any time, and in any location, to the detriment of local communities seeking to regulate public space. That is also not what the Eighth Amendment says. The sole prohibition is that cities cannot jail someone if they have nowhere else to go. So if shelter is available to an individual, the Eighth Amendment is not violated. And that brings us to the fourth core myth that California cities have really presented to the Supreme Court, which is that their hands are tied on homelessness. We again see them suggesting that federal courts have prevented them from offering shelter and services to unhoused people, from enforcing laws against those who do have access to shelter, and from investing in the critical short-term shelter and long-term affordable housing solutions necessary to solve homelessness. Now, again, all of that is false. The state of California filed a brief separately from every California politician to make perfectly clear that these spurious claims are false. California jurisdictions can and must address homelessness now, using every tool at their disposal, including expanding access to affordable housing and emergency shelter. So with those myths dispelled, our brief gets at the heart of what is really going on here, which is that there's a profound gap between the proactive policies California has promised its taxpayers to finally address street homelessness and then the reality on the ground. San Francisco in particular has promised its taxpayers for years that it was offering the affordable housing and shelter necessary to actually end street homelessness. Instead, the city has failed every affordable housing target by thousands of units, while actually losing part of the past stock of affordable housing. The shelter system is at capacity every single day of the year. Hundreds are waiting in line for shelter and forced to sleep outside, and the city has actually shut its same-day shelter wait lines. So instead of confronting that reality, San Francisco has cited, fined, and arrested thousands of unhoused people to give the guise that it was addressing homelessness, despite being totally unable to show that the vast majority of those individuals actually had a shelter or affordable housing placement available to them. A federal district court made clear factual findings that San Francisco was violating its own policies and laws by doing that, facts which the city never contested on appeal. And the city's own internal audit confirmed the same by noting that the city's street teams, quote, do not achieve their established goals. So that's the source of the political drama that has unfolded before the Supreme Court. It's San Francisco and other California politicians knowing the law, agreeing what the Constitution says, knowing that jailing people for being poor is wrong and won't address the affordable housing or the street homelessness crisis, but then not wanting to face public accountability for doing just that. But that accountability is critical. We need our leaders to actually deliver on their commitments to expand affordable housing and shelter and to actually make a dent in the street homelessness crisis, not rely on criminalization practices that waste taxpayer money while trampling fundamental civil rights. And our leaders are already there in principle. We need them there in fact. But that has nothing to do with the narrow legal question before the Supreme Court, where we all agree that the Supreme Court must uphold decades of its precedent protecting people from draconian punishments for circumstances beyond their control. So that's our overview, and with that, I'll turn it over to some of our amici to address these issues in their own words, beginning with Angela from the Public Defender's Office.
Good morning. Thank you, Zal, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights for hosting this press conference. My name is Angela Chan. I'm an Assistant Chief Attorney at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. I lead our Confront and Advocate team. What do we confront? State-sponsored violence. And state-sponsored violence is why we are gathered here today at this press conference. It's why elected San Francisco Public Defender Mano Raju and the Public Defender's Office have signed onto this amicus brief, urging the Supreme Court to find the grants pass law criminalizing people for being unhoused unconstitutional. What is it if not state-sponsored violence when we respond to the most vulnerable in our communities, people who are unhoused, by arresting them when they sleep outside with so much as a blanket, simply for being poor? What is it if not state-sponsored violence when police spend city resources to arrest people for simply sleeping outside because there are no shelter beds available? As our amicus brief so clearly explains, it is cruel and unusual to jail the unhoused and call it housing policy. It is not housing policy. Our office represents about 20,000 clients a year. 51% of our clients are Black. That's extreme disproportionality to the 6% Black population in San Francisco. That gives you a sense of how racist our criminal system is in San Francisco. All of our clients are low income and many are unhoused. Our clients are often victims of police violence, and in many cases, they have experienced police encounters where rather than being offered help, they're met with their belongings and their shelter bed being taken away and destroyed. They're forced to move to sleep on another street, but not offered housing to sleep in a warm bed. And let me underscore that this police enforcement has continued to take place, even where there's been an injunction from a federal judge prohibiting these illegal actions by the city. And we're all fed up with the homelessness crisis. All of us are. This includes people who are unhoused, who are the most impacted and the most harmed by the gross lack of affordable housing in California, which is at its most extreme in San Francisco, with more than 75% of households paying rent that is unaffordable to them, according to federal guidelines. People who are unhoused in San Francisco are also fed up living night after night on the street in a city with so much immense wealth, with 63 billionaires in San Francisco, more than any other city in the country. People who are unhoused are fed up with the city's grossly inadequate shelter system that is thousands of beds short and functionally at capacity every day, which forces the majority of San Francisco's unhoused residents to sleep outside because they have no access to shelter. Criminalizing people for being poor only puts unhoused people in more bleak circumstances, taking away what little property they have to survive. As our amicus brief points out, jailing people for being unhoused does not make housing affordable to them. It makes things worse. It should be common sense, but it's something that seems to have escaped the city and state leaders who have put in their really invalid arguments. As a city and a state that prides itself on being forward-thinking, compassionate, and equitable, we can do better. California can do better. San Francisco can do better. The response to lawsuits like the one filed against Grants Pass, Oregon, and the one filed against San Francisco should be for state and city leaders, our governor, our mayor, to rethink how we respond to the decades-long housing crisis that was created intentionally by racist zoning laws and a refusal to build enough affordable housing. The response should be a shift away from criminalization and shirking blame to instead prioritizing the use of our public resources to care for those who are most in need of our support, those who are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Really appreciate it. And for everyone who's joined us, we have a Q&A function. And if you have questions for the Q&A afterwards, please go ahead and start dropping those in the chat, and we'll take those as they come in to us. But for now, I'll turn it over to Kaki Marshall, who is San Francisco's former director of temporary shelter.
Thank you so much, Zal, and thank you for coordinating this and holding this press conference. I just want to share briefly a little bit about myself. My name is Kaki Marshall, and I began being the Director of Shelters and Temporary Shelter and Outreach in 2018. And I'm a formerly homeless youth. I was homeless in the city and county of San Francisco as a youth until I was about 25 years old. And I went through various nonprofit organizations here in the Bay Area to assist myself in getting out of that situation. And then I began working for them. I first worked for Centerpoint Incorporated, which is the place where I first entered into my recovery. And I was there for about 8 years, and then I moved on to building opportunities for self-sufficiency in the East Bay. I've been on several local coordinating committees for safety, for public safety in Alameda County, been on task forces for designing the trust clinic and the model of benefits advocacy for homeless people that are disabled and are eligible for federal resources. And after about 20 years working in the field and working with different nonprofits and part of the Western Regional Advocacy Partnership, WRAP, and working with Mano to produce the Homeless Person's Bill of Rights, I had gained a very large network and a lot of insight into the homeless system. I was happy to take that job because I had seen the San Francisco 5-year strategic framework for addressing homelessness. In that strategic framework, San Francisco put out some very admirable goals and policies. I was really pleased at the idea of building low barrier navigation centers that we could use with a coordinated entry process so that we could prioritize San Francisco's most vulnerable residents for our most expensive intervention. I had a conversation with the leader of HSH as I was being hired, our final conversation, a level-setting conversation, he called it, where he said, you know, I'm aware of your advocacy and I want to make sure that you're coming into this role and we won't have any problems with you enforcing our efforts to move people into shelters once we are able to have those shelter resources available. And I said, as long as you don't ask me to ever break the law with regards to the Boise decision, and we're not criminalizing people for sleeping outside when we have no shelter alternatives to offer them, we won't have any problem. I was assured that all of the street encampment efforts would be operated in such a way as to give me at least 10 days, if not a month, to work with our contractors and the homeless encampment removal teams to make contact with all of the homeless folks in any encampment before any type of sweeps or removal efforts were instigated that included Public Works and San Francisco Police Department. Unfortunately, when I took the job, what I found out was nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, over the year plus that I was there and we began building the navigation centers, every single one of those navigation centers, sometimes as many as 150 beds per navigation centers. Before we would open the navigation center, we would have to make a deal with the district supervisor in order to build that navigation center in their district, that we would first utilize those beds to clear any encampments in their district that were causing an exceptional amount of complaints from their constituents. These removals in the beginning seemed to be being done with the same effort that I was promised, where we would have our HOT team and our contractors be able to make contact with folks and assess them using the coordinated entry tool to find our most vulnerable population and then use those navigation beds for them. Unfortunately, that was not that was our policy, but that was not the practice. The practice was that every single person was offered a bed in that navigation center, whether or not they were priority status, which was not really a solution to their homelessness, because those navigation centers, our most expensive intervention that are open 24 hours a day, would not be helpful in finding permanent housing for those people. And those people were not able to find their own housing through problem solving in the short period of time we would allow them to stay there, which created another set of problems, which is that now you've brought people into your shelter and you haven't been able to provide them housing, and you're kicking them out back onto the street, which makes them a little less interested in accepting that shelter offer the next time it comes around. So the reality was that these sweeps were taking place with shorter and shorter time frames. And by the time I'd been there about 6 months, these sweeps started to be happening without any notice at all. And the most expensive interventions that we had, the navigation beds, continued to be used for different operations that the mayor or the mayor's chief of staff or the Healthy Streets Operations Center would deem as the appropriate location. On several occasions, I would tell my supervisor that there was the director of the homeless services, Jeff Kaczynski, that I didn't have more than 10 available beds in the navigation centers for an impending mission that was being planned at HSOC that would require up to, we would count about 150 homeless people, or even at this one particular incident I wrote in my disposition, I think it was 50, and I only had 10 beds available yet. It was reported to the police and to that team that we would be able to have all of the beds that they needed, that we simply didn't have the resources. I fought and I fought to try and tell the truth, to try and abide by our policies, but I was no match for the chief of police and the director of public works and the HSOC team, which was the Healthy Streets Operations Center, which seemed to be really focused on just making homelessness and poverty less visible to the people who were complaining. The refusal to receive shelter was a myth that started to be generated out of HSOC because of the urgency that was in that space around moving people. I fought to make sure that we were having our HOT team at least mark that people were not refusing shelter and that the shelter that was offered to them was a one-day shelter. If you're offering a shelter to someone who has belongings with them, a place to go for one day, and then they're kicked back out onto the street, that's not helpful for them. Although that is largely what the San Francisco police were doing in order to protect them from this decision. People don't refuse shelter if we have resources that allow them to take their belongings and come with us for a period of time that will allow them to use that shelter as a means to move into temporary housing. It's very useful for that. The consequences for me, myself, I had to leave that job. I could no longer manage my integrity. Just, I had to take a stand, and I had to come out and join the efforts of people to hold the city accountable. There are tons of amazing people in the homeless services industry in San Francisco. The policies that we wrote are wonderful. The strategic plan is something that everyone agreed with was beautiful, but it simply was not what was happening on the ground. California, all California leaders and the governor and the mayor are all in agreement that what was happening in Grants Pass is wrong. And they were all in agreement that those were draconian policies. And they were all in agreement when I was hired to that job, and even to the day that I left, maintained that they were in agreement with our policies and they believed we were following them. It's just not what's happening on the ground. So I think I will go ahead and turn this over to Brandon. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today.
Oh, thank you so much, Kaki. And Brandon, before we turn to you, I know folks may have some follow-ups for Kaki based on this information. And I think in the brief, we do take a significant amount of time to address the profound gap between the policies in San Francisco and then the fact of really no available shelter on a day-to-day basis for at least 4,000 unsheltered individuals, hundreds of whom are seeking shelter actively at this time. So that is very well covered in the brief, particularly in section 4. And I will turn it over to Brandon.
Thank you. My name is Brandon Green. I am the policy director of the Western Center. Formerly, I directed the Racial and Economic Justice Program at ACLU of Northern California, which was one of the organizations that brought the San Francisco litigation. Centrally in my position there was framing houselessness as a racial justice issue, which it is. Both in America and in California, Black individuals are disproportionately represented amongst the unhoused population. The Reparations Task Force in California detailed with great specificity why this is, from discrimination in housing programs to federal programs that made home ownership available, to disproportionate entanglement within the criminal legal system, to the racialized wealth gap. All the various on-ramps to houselessness disproportionately impact Black Californians and Black Americans writ large. And so the responses to houselessness are also racialized. Black folks are also disproportionately represented in traffic stops, disproportionately represented in stop and frisk, all of these various on-ramps to the criminal legal system, which are on-ramps to houselessness. And if those numbers look different, if Black and brown folks were not disproportionately represented amongst the unhoused population, the solutions would look very different. These very racialized, deliberate policies also sync with decades-long disinvestment from affordable housing. Most cities in California, including San Francisco, are far behind their affordable housing goals. That's a problem. Most of the places in which the policy solution is to sweep, disappear unhoused folks, do not have anywhere close to the amount of shelter beds necessary for people, again, because of either lack investment or disinvestment. We know other things that work. For example, the Benioff Center did a study that showed that giving people $500, for example, would be stabilizing. Giving individuals $500 a month is far less expensive than creating the entire infrastructure to criminalize and disappear people. We know that when you move people from one section of the city, they end up going to another section of the city. And that is neither a solution that is fiscally responsible, nor is it a policy solution that actually helps effectuate what we'd all like to see, which is people having adequate, stable housing and shelter. And it's important to raise this as a racial justice issue at this point in time, in which DEI policies and everything in racial justice are under attack and under threat. And so as we continue to push for protecting the existing protections that stop the criminalization, we also have to think about very targeted solutions given the population of people who are disproportionately impacted. But here's the historical harm that have been that they've had to navigate through, so that we can actually put forward solutions that make sense and that are long-term solutions, not this sort of short-term, misguided, continued criminalization that will only further entrench people within the criminal legal system, saddle them with fines and fees, and other things that we, again, are already on the justice system. So create a vicious circle in which people continue to have to navigate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brandon. And now we'll turn it over to Chesa.
Thank you, Zal. Thank you all for being here with us today. My name is Chesa Boudin. I'm the former San Francisco District Attorney, and I was honored to be able to sign on to this amicus brief because it deals with an issue that is critical, both to our humanity as a city and to our public safety. I want to start by just emphasizing that there is a critical difference between political theory and theater and real solutions. We know well what works to solve problems like homelessness. There is an abundance of research documenting effective solutions and responses to get people off of the street and onto their feet. And yet, what we are seeing from San Francisco's elected officials in this moment and on this issue is fear-mongering, misinformation, and political theater that is holding San Francisco back from actually addressing what are very real problems impacting all of us. It is really shocking to me, and it should be shocking to all of us, that we are now in front of the Trump-dominated US Supreme Court on this issue. And we're there in part because California leaders who are perfectly clear on what the law is and say that they agree with it simply do not want to take accountability for their actions or be held accountable by their constituents for their intentional and systematic failure to implement policies that solve homelessness. Now, the stakes are extremely high in a case pending before the US Supreme Court. We all know what the likely outcome is going to be. And the fact that San Francisco played a role in getting this issue, an issue about the bounds of something as critical to our values and our identity and our humanity as the limits of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, is a disgrace. I also want to just emphasize for a moment that the notion that dumping yet another social problem onto the police is going to somehow solve the problem is both ridiculous and counterproductive. The reality is San Francisco police have a big job already, and they are solving fewer than 20% of robberies. Across this country, police are solving less than 50% of reported violent crime. And so to ask the US Supreme Court, as San Francisco's leaders have done, to open the floodgates to making police responsible and prosecutors in criminal courts responsible for policing the homeless is both inhumane, ineffective, and will undermine our broader public safety goals. Let me be very clear. Police cannot do all things at all times. Our criminal courts are already overburdened. Not only are we seeing the district attorney and the mayor and others blame our judges, protest outside of a federal courthouse in behavior that is anti-democratic and shockingly similar to what we see former President Trump doing when he doesn't like the outcome of a court ruling. But we are also seeing them try to foist yet another social problem onto police at a time when we need police to focus on the categories of crime and the issues that they are uniquely positioned to address: robbery, rape, murder, areas where we need police to do far better than they are doing today. The brutality and the cruelty inherent in criminalizing homelessness and poverty is on full display in the hypocrisy of the city and county of San Francisco's approach to this issue and its brief asking the US Supreme Court to grant review of the Grants Pass decision. By choosing this path, the city risks playing into the hands of the divisive tactics championed by people like Donald Trump. Our actions collectively as a city, as a community in this moment, will not only impact the lives of all San Francisco residents, but also will define our legacy as a beacon of progress or a cautionary tale of lost values. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chesa. And now we're going to turn it over for questions. If folks have questions in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will handle as many of those questions as we can in the time we have. We already have one question that we can get started with. And this question is, what do you say to taxpayers who are rightly frustrated about street homelessness and the impact on local businesses and families? And I'm happy to start with an answer to that question, but I would love to turn it over to all of our panelists to speak from their perspective as well. But I guess my view on that is that people are right to be frustrated. The city has promised us real solutions to homelessness with sound policies that it has not delivered on. So how can it be that we're still missing all of our affordable housing targets that have been set by the state, right? Even by San Francisco's own city planning department, haven't even come close to those affordable housing targets. How can it be that we do not have shelter for thousands of longtime residents who need it? That's not a problem that many other jurisdictions across the country have. So that anger, the frustration, which is righteous, it should be translated into accountability to tell our politicians that we deserve better, that we demand better. And we have to focus on the fact that politicians have instead concealed their wrongdoing to avoid that accountability, to use criminalization as the shield from public accountability. Well, what we really need are answers, not excuses. And so I would say, like, absolutely, we should be frustrated. We should be focused on this issue, and we should be demanding better from our leaders. But happy to turn it over to anyone else. Yeah, Kathy, please go ahead.
Yeah, in my position, the budget for my operation was close to $300 million. And if that money had been being spent the way it was outlined in our strategic plan, where all of the contractors that we are paying, we're spending money for them to be focusing on our most vulnerable population, spending the time to move our most vulnerable population into our most expensive intervention, the navigation centers, and then having our contractors work with people that we know are eligible for permanent supportive housing to move them in there. Unfortunately, for the entire year that I was at the department, what we were using our most expensive resource for was for criminal enforcement to give the cops cover so that they wouldn't be guilty. And that still wasn't enough shelter beds. Even in those situations, in those planned sweeps, we didn't have enough shelter beds. And in the whole entire system, we're about 4,000 shelter beds short every single night. We knew for a fact 4,000 people would be sleeping rough on the street every night. Yet still, we took our most expensive interventions and we let them be utilized and usurped by the Healthy Streets Operations Center, where the police and public works drove the use of homeless services, which is not what should be driving homeless services. Public safety is not what should be driving homeless services. The homeless department's strategic plan to have contractors who are social workers, not police, meeting homeless people where they're at and using our expensive resources to take them into will actually change the way that the population that's on the street looks, because you're pulling the sickest people out. It turns out that a large amount of the people who are homeless actually end up resolving their own homelessness every year because of their ability to engage in our problem solving or their ability to use their own structures to get out of homelessness. It's the population that's chronically homeless that we're seeing on the street that's causing the problem. And if we keep usurping the budget that's meant to go to social services and treating our most vulnerable population with the services that they need to get them off of the streets, and we keep taking those and using them for public safety to criminalize homelessness and force people away from where they are or into a shelter for one day, that's why our budget is not working, and there should be accountability for that. But this certainly is not the way to get there.
And I would add that is such helpful insight from doing the work directly in San Francisco. I would add that the people who are frustrated, which I think includes everyone here, and any San Franciscan walking around and kind of seeing the gross inequality in our city, the frustration should be directed at our elected officials. It should be directed at our mayor, our governor, people who have the power to direct resources towards the solution. It seems pretty simple. I don't know how it's gotten so complicated, that the solution to being unhoused is to build affordable housing and to provide people with emergency shelter when they need it, rather than redirecting that money towards police sheriff's, probation, to basically make people's lives who are vulnerable worse, to make it more difficult to have a stable, supportive environment. We spend about $1.5 billion on our carceral system in San Francisco. That's about the exact same amount the city attorney, David Chu, has estimated is needed to build enough affordable housing for everyone in San Francisco. So the math is pretty easy. I think a kindergartner can do it. And that is where I think everyone should direct their frustrations, is putting pressure on the same people who took the time to draft an amicus brief on the other side to promote the misuse of city resources and state resources, and ask them to really get their head on straight. I think that's where I would direct my frustration.
Oh yeah, Kaki, please go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to, while we're on the topic of budgets, I just want to say that while I was at HSOC, focusing on trying to get us to use the public health perspective as what guided us, rather than the 311 perspective, which were complaints about people in spaces where folks didn't want them to be, I was able to see that the larger picture of street sweeps and public safety that do not involve any social workers making contact with homeless people, the daily operation of steam cleaning streets with public work trucks, driving behind them, taking people's property and putting it in the trash when they're not able to move it quick enough before the steam cleaners come, with no social work, no offer of shelter. The budget for that is close to $1 billion a year to clean the street impact of homelessness in the city and county of San Francisco. And so if we took that funding, or at least a large portion of it, and invested it in what we know works, the solutions that we know works, navigation centers, to move people into permanent supportive housing, mainstream vouchers for housing subsidies. We know all of that funding goes right back into the community when we use those resources. The studies have been done and published, and it's all available. So yeah, that would be something, as a taxpayer, something I'm outraged about.
Thank you, Kaki. Any of our other panelists want to address this question? I know we have a couple others in the queue. Great, well, I can go there. So we got a question in the chat. What is the impact that you see for this amicus brief on the Grants Pass case? And I can, again, start with this question. So I guess our goal for this amicus brief was to address the unsupported hand-wringing of many California cities and politicians who are looking to blame judges for their own failure to address the homelessness crisis, with issues that have absolutely nothing to do with the very narrow doctrine that says you shouldn't jail someone just for being poor, right? That's the only issue that's actually before the Supreme Court in the Grants Pass case. All California amici actually agree with that, including the governor and the mayor of San Francisco and the major cities and the state of California. And yet what we see is a profound amount of disinformation and alarmism, false alarmism, about being powerless to address homelessness, when we know that San Francisco and all California cities retain every legitimate tool to actually address the crisis. The brief goes through and unpacks each of those unsupported arguments so that the Supreme Court stays focused on the only narrow issue before the court and the only issue that actually matters, which is that there's universal agreement. Criminalization of homelessness is not only unconstitutional, but also fundamentally illogical. Any other folks have thoughts or reflections on that question? Great, well, I'm happy to turn to another one. We also got a question, what about the drug crisis? Doesn't police enforcement help address that? And I guess what I would say to that is that arresting people for sleeping outside is totally unrelated to the drug crisis, right? Jailing someone because they have nowhere to sleep is not criminal enforcement that is any way related to drugs. Nor is that actually really related to homelessness and the drivers of homelessness in general, right? So that's why the places in the United States that have the highest rates of opioid and substance use addiction are not the places that experience homelessness. Communities like Arkansas and Alabama that have very high incidents of opioid usage also have the lowest rates of homelessness because housing is affordable in those communities. And so that's why the leading study from UCSF that came out this year identifies that of the thousands of homeless people in California, again, most of whom are from California, have been priced out of their community, the predominant barrier for those individuals to get back into houses is the inability to afford rent. That's the primary driver of homelessness. So again, we can talk about the drug crisis, and that's a serious crisis. It merits a serious response, but it's not the same as the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis. And it's critical to disaggregate those issues to understand that only affordable housing will actually improve homelessness. And then we need to separately address and intervene on the drug crisis.
I want to just also make very clear on this issue, because this is frankly one of the areas in which we've seen the most pernicious disinformation from city leaders. To the extent San Franciscans want to see a police response to the drug crisis, and that is a separate conversation, as Al said, nothing about the Grants Pass case prevents them from doing that. If police want to enforce laws, whether they be drug laws or possession of stolen property or domestic violence or any other criminal laws on our statutes, they can do so. And they have no restrictions related to Grants Pass from doing so. The reality is that if someone is living in a tent and they're committing some other crime, whether it be drugs or otherwise, police can and do go in and make arrests, and prosecutors can and do file criminal cases. So it is really important that we understand, contrary to the disinformation campaign from City Hall, that giving the police the mandate and the authority to criminalize homelessness in and of itself is a totally separate question from whether or not police can enforce other criminal laws in homeless camps. Police can, and they do all the time, and nothing about the Grants Pass status quo prevents them from doing that.
Thank you so much, Chase. That's a really important point. Okay, and I think we have time for one more question, and this is one I'd love to get all panelists' opinions on. But the question is, what should San Francisco be doing right now to address homelessness? Kaki, please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, they should follow their own policies. There are incredibly brilliant people in the city that are hard at work in the homeless department that have created amazing policies. Coordinated entry is a program that allows contractors to assess every single homeless person in the city and county of San Francisco. And if we give the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing and our contractors the space and the time to work with the most vulnerable people in our population and provide the services that we've built for them, I think we have a pretty good, and we also are consistently building the units, the permanent supportive housing units, and meeting our own goals that we have set on that. We'll be doing a great job. Our policies are great. The folks who are in those positions in that department are amazing, wonderful, talented, brilliant people. We just need the leaders to follow the policies and to not try and continually coerce. I was coerced. I feel like I was coerced to continually break policies day after day. And so as long as that's not happening, we should be in good shape.
Well, all around the public defender's office over at 7th and Bryant are empty buildings, shiny, new tech spaces that are empty because people are working from home and doing other things. And so there are plenty of resources, there are plenty of spaces available in San Francisco that can be used for affordable housing, for emergency shelter. It is a matter of our city leaders prying themselves away from a carceral approach that doesn't work, and instead taking the immense amount of resources the city has to give people housing. It is unfortunate that all this time has been devoted to dealing with city leaders going the wrong direction and filing such a wrong-headed amicus brief. And I'm so glad that we were able to lay out these arguments and make really clear for the Supreme Court and for everyone involved that the answer to this question about whether it's cruel and unusual in violation of the 8th Amendment of the Constitution to criminalize people simply for sleeping outside and being unhoused, that is wrong, right? We can do better, and we have to do better. And so I think that's a solution, is to put our efforts towards a public health and a community caring solution rather than a carceral one.
Thank you. Chase or Brandon, any reflections on that?
You know, there's been really amazing research done by folks who have tremendous expertise in what actually solves this crisis. We're not short on funds, and we're not short on answers. What we're short on is political will to do the right thing. And it's high time that San Francisco's leaders stop spreading disinformation, stop engaging in Trump-like attacks on our judges and the independent judiciary, and start following the law and getting to work to solve a crisis that impacts all of us.
I would just emphasize what I already said, which is that houselessness in America is essentially a racial justice issue. And until we approach it from that standpoint, understanding the various ways that racialized policies have created the issue, then we won't get towards solution. And doing things that we already know don't work and already disruptive to people, and that further expand the racialization of the issue is not going to help solve the problem either. For example, the Oakland Office for Racial Equity did a report some time back called the Equity Indicators Report. I mean, almost every sort of category of life in Oakland, Black folks lag behind. That's rental burden, that's police contact, that's that is use of force by police, all of these various things. And so we know that creating infrastructure that further criminalizes folks is not going to be helpful. We know that now we know that something like guaranteed income pilots are helpful for sustainability. We know that when you actually get people into permanent supportive housing, that is stabilizing. And we know that a large portion of our unhoused neighbors have been within the various systems, the criminal legal system, the foster care system, all of those things that also disproportionately impact Black folks. So it's systematic failures writ large. And I am personally of the belief that because of who is most severely impacted, that is why we rely on solutions from the past that criminalize folks, as opposed to putting forward solutions that wouldn't. And we've seen things like this before, whether we're talking about the response to the methamphetamine issue versus like the crack issue, what we're seeing in terms of how we put forward solutions for addiction and other things when it is disproportionately impacting folks that don't look like me versus when it disproportionately impacts who look like me. And I think it's very important to emphasize that, as I said, we are currently in a social political climate where all of those things are under threat and under attack. And so we will continue to further the issues if we don't make sound policy solutions and put those who are most severely impacted at the forefront of what it is that we're doing in terms of policy.
Thank you so much, everyone. Those are really, really helpful answers. I guess the one thing I might add to the mix, and this is discussed in the amicus brief, it's also in a letter that Lawyers Committee sent to the City Attorney's Office in San Francisco back in August. What do you do with a jurisdiction that has good policies on paper but doesn't follow them, right? And that's where the accountability gap is profound. And that's where court monitoring can be really helpful, right? Like if San Francisco has already promised to taxpayers particular affordable housing targets, a promise to fill all vacant supportive housing units, of which the last time I looked, there were at least 700 still vacant. for minor reasons like fixing them up or getting the bureaucratic paperwork done to actually get unhoused folks into those units, or just following the city's own street homelessness policies on how to approach and address encampments and make sure that shelter is available to folks. If the political will is there also to actually meet those targets, then a court-supported monitor that actually ensures that the city is doing what it said it was doing, is spending its money in the right ways, is actually following through. That's what is going to cure the gap between intentions and outcomes. An actual monitor to make sure we're getting it done. Because the reality is, for the last decade at least, we've been sold promises that have not even remotely been delivered on, and taxpayers deserve to pay more attention to that and deserve to hold their leaders accountable for it. And the court process can actually do that. Great. Well, thank you all so much. That's all the questions we received. Again, happy to speak offline with anyone who wants to speak from the press. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us, and really appreciate everyone for tuning in for this event. Thanks very much, everyone.